Let us begin, as has become customary in Australia, by reflecting just for a minute on the Aboriginal people of Australia, especially in this law school, the Aboriginal people who suffered very great deprivations of their rights, denial of their legal rights, denial of the basic rights to their land, which we have to say was ultimately addressed not by a democratic legislature, which had been in existence for 150 years from the colonial times in Australia, but by the High Court of Australia in the Mabo decision. I acknowledge the Aboriginal people and, in a sense, their struggle for the recognition of rights has some reflections for us as we address the issues that will be before this conference tonight and as I proceed to launch the book. Let's also pause just for a minute to think of Brian and his support and the financial support of those who've given funds to Voiceless, to RSPCA Australia, to other organisations, civil society organisations, which are our right as citizens of this country to belong to, and which speak for animals and speak for us. Not enough that they just speak for us. It's important, I think, that they speak for the rights of animals, and that is one of the themes that is addressed in the book. I don't want you to think too much or too long about Voiceless because I'm extremely cross with them. As the third most popular book launcher in this nation, to be given 10 minutes, 10 miserable minutes to launch this highly provocative, upsetting, energising, angry, rational book is a very irritating and annoying thing. I mean, just try to think how you would tackle the launch of such a book in 10 minutes. I spent most of today reading the book because I haven't had a lot of time before today, but I've read it cover to cover. And I have to tell you, it's a very upsetting read. About a decade and a half ago, I gave a speech. It was in the country. I can't remember exactly where it was, but it upset farming interests enormously because I had the temerity to suggest that there was an ethical, a moral, and perhaps a future legal issue in the way we in Australia pressed our farming to the very borders of our huge, dry, often waterless continental country. I then tasted, as a citizen, the anger of those who said I was out of touch, I had no idea, I was unrealistic, I was irrational, I was emotional, and I was getting carried away. I have to say that in a period of about a decade that I served as a patron of RSPCA Australia, I was very pleased to see the change that came about in RSPCA Australia, no doubt with a little bit of yapping at the heels from Voiceless and from other organisations and citizens in our country, to extend the interest of that organisation beyond a primary concern with domestic companion animals into concern with other sentient beings and animals in our farming sector. If I have a little criticism of this book, it is that it doesn't follow the historical way in which the law responded to concerns about the cruelty to animals, because the history of the English law and of the law of Australia in dealing with animal welfare, as it was called, began with a concern about domestic animals. Why? Because they were very close, they were very visible, often they were very loved, and they were treated as part of the family, and therefore people got very upset when others were cruel to them. And humans could empathise with them, and humans would not only look on them as things, as chattels, as personal property in the law, though that they were from the law's point of view, but would look at them as creatures which shared the emotions which one could see in any domestic animal, quite similar to the emotions that human beings go through, if not the whole range of them exactly the same. The book, after a very perceptive introduction by the editors, which perhaps lays a bit too much emphasis on scholarship, and that's the title of the 17th and final chapter, Scholarship, Scholarship, Scholarship. Well, we need scholarship, and we're going to get it at Sydney Law School, but also at Southern Cross, at Macquarie, and about 6 other law schools of Australia. We need scholarship, but we also need empirical research, and we need to bring to the attention of the people of this much blessed country the facts and the data that are locked in the pages of this book. If only the people knew the pain, the unkindness, the cruelty that is done to sentient animals, I think they would demand action. When I read the chapter quite early in the book about farm animals, which was before the domestic animals but should have been after, when I read that chapter, I had an increasing feeling of despair and an increasing feeling of anger, because though I had learned about a decade ago that chicken live their lives in the huge corporate factories which produce them for enormous output and consumption in the Australian market as well as elsewhere, live their lives, those social animals, genetically programmed to interact with each other, live their lives in a space equivalent to an A4 size piece of paper. That was a horrifying thought when it was first presented to me, because I lived my life with A4 paper. But this book brings home to you that the cruelty that is done to chicken in huge numbers, a cruelty which extends from the meat-produced chicken to the egg-laying chicken that have developed from an animal that could produce 7 eggs in a year to one that can produce up to 1 every day by special breeding and by other means, that confined in such small space, they suffer, as the egg-producing chicken do as well, in part because of the slope of the floor designed to remove excrement and the like, but which produces in millions of chicken disabilities which cause enormous pain, lifelong pain. But that's not all. The book goes on to describe what goes on without, I believe, our knowledge, until you read a book like this, in the treatment of pigs and in the treatment also now of cattle. The confines in which sows are kept are about 1/2 metre by 2 metres. That is their life. They're excluded from animal welfare legislation because of the choice that has been made by our lawmakers to deal with them separately. When I finished reading the chapter on farm animals, I was so upset that I felt a need to have another human being whom I loved and trusted to talk about what I had just discovered. And I rang my partner at home and told him of these terrible discoveries that are contained in this book. I'm sure many of you here know about all these things because you've been closer to this issue than I've been. And I knew, I suppose, generally, but I didn't know the data, the raw data. And my partner said, it's not going to change until we reduce the number of human beings who are consuming all this food and thereby putting pressure on markets to produce vast quantities of meat, which is the reason behind the corporatisation of meat production. I told him that we've got to go and eat more and more fish, because at least fish, in the way we normally produce fish for the market in Australia, have a life. He said that the growing production of farmed fish is going to produce the same problem in the field of fish as is produced in the field of mammals and is recorded in this book. Well, I commend to those who don't know the chapter on farming, because I don't believe the people of Australia know these facts. And I don't know how we can produce the information that will get the facts in these pages to the minds of the kind, generous, and generally spiritual people of our country. The book is divided into the Australian and New Zealand law on the subject, and it draws to notice the fact that when in the 19th century people said you're not going to be able to change the laws on slavery, you're not going to be able to remove the cruelty to slaves, a great civil movement began, and it began in England, and it was largely a movement of ordinary folks, and it ultimately led to the pressure on governments and the enactment of laws which required the Royal Navy to apprehend the slave trading ships, and that led eventually to the abolition of slavery in the world. So you can't say things can't be done, because with enough will and enough knowledge and enough passion on the part of people, things can be done. And slavery is the paradigm which the book suggests is available for dealing with reforms in the field of animal law. The book deals with the theoretical questions that lie at the heart of changing legal attitudes, and how one changes those attitudes and then changes law, or changes law and stimulates changes of attitudes, which is what happened with the rights of the Aboriginal people to their land, is a question which isn't ultimately resolved in the book, but it's certainly presented in the chapters for our consideration. There is an excellent chapter on the live export of animals, and the cruelty which is revealed in that chapter reinforced my sense of upset at reading this book and at the facts that it reveals. There are very useful chapters. The one on experimentation by Paula Gerber is an excellent review of the subject. There's an examination by Stephen White of animals in the wild. There's a chapter on recreational hunting. I think I should send a photocopy of that to the former Vice President of the United States, Mr. Cheney, and also to Justice Scalia, and to others who engage in hunting and shooting simply for the pleasure of it. There are some amazing stories on sentencing. When I told my partner Jan about the New Zealand case of the man who hit 5 cats with an iron bar, causing virtual decapitation of the cats, and was then fined, a fine which was increased on appeal to 3 months' imprisonment, he, no doubt thinking of our cat, Sheba, a beautiful Abyssinian, was absolutely outraged. The sentences for animal cruelty are really quite amazing and astonishing, and this book does a service in bringing them to the fore. That chapter is written by Annabel Markham. The book then turns to international law. It examines the reactions of the European Union and shows how in many ways the European Union is in advance of us in Australia. It examines international law and the international declarations that have dealt with aspects of this issue, though it points out that the World Trade Organization and the free trade agreements that are negotiated put difficulties in the way of preventing the import of goods, even though they might be offensive to the culture and standards of the home country. There's a very good chapter by Andrew Bartlett on the perspective of a federal politician in Australia and of the disparities between the laws of the different states. Disparity is not necessarily a bad thing, because that is how we experiment in Australia. It was the elected government of Don Dunstan in South Australia that enacted so many laws that when people saw that the world didn't come to an end, they began to use those laws elsewhere in Australia, and that is possibly a way that we in Australia will see improvements if one can persuade a particular government to take the initiative. And then Peter Sankoff comes back to his hobby horse of scholarship on the subject of scholarship in the last chapter. Well, I think scholarship's important, and this is a book of scholarship, but it's also a book of much more. It's a book of empirical facts which buzz around in the brain and which are facts that I don't believe most Australians know of, and they should know of it. Now, it's the role of a book launcher, as accomplished as myself, to look thoroughly through this book to try to find some typos. I mean, no book launcher is worth his or her salt if they don't find a typo. When you get book launchers, don't trust them, because they've probably not read the book. But I couldn't find any typos, but I did find one inappropriate adjective. The adjective of Descartes is Cartesian, and that's on page 2 in Mr. Sankoff's chapter. But I could hardly see that error because there were so many references to scholarship and scholarly. When the book is reproduced by Chris Holt, who can be very proud of this production of Federation Press, when it's reproduced, I'd suggest switching farming and domestic animals, because that's how it all happened in English law. It began when concern arose about domestic animals, and then it spread. But then you get to the last chapter, and this is a bit of a weakness in the book too, and it needs to be addressed, I think, in the next edition. I'm left at the end of the book as a person very upset by what I have read, without really knowing where one goes from here. Now, when I was in Boston last week, I saw a very interesting article in the New York Times about Richard Wrangham, a primatologist and anthropologist who has lived the last 30 years trying to imitate the life of chimpanzees in order to try to understand how from the great apes, human beings evolved. His theory is it fundamentally came about when, in the course of killing animals for food, the striking of the hammer caused flint, and that caused flame, and flame caused fire, and that caused communal fires, and that caused the cooking of food, and that caused people to sit across a table, well, not a table, across the stone, look at each other and modify their behaviour, and that caused the brain to increase in size. And this is a fundamental problem, and I don't know what the answer to it is, and it needs to be addressed by advocates of change. The fact seems to be, and I should say, that Professor Wrangham is a vegetarian. He hasn't eaten mammal food for 30 years because he says, I will not eat an animal I haven't myself killed. And as he's not in the business of killing animals, he won't eat meat. But the fact is that our species seems to have developed in part because of the consumption of meat. And therefore, in addressing the issue of what we do to reduce the cruelty that is definitely proved by these pages, and what we do to change the law, we have to address where we cut out in the sentient beings and provide greater protection and dignity, and on what principle we do that, and what we require in a creature which isn't any time soon going to stop eating meat. And if that is so, I think that is the challenge of an 18th chapter of the book, to try to work out where we go from here, given the horrors that are revealed. There is nothing like those horrors unless you've seen the movies of Eisenhower being shown around the death camps after the Second World War. People will object to that and say you shouldn't compare the cruelty to animals to the cruelty to human beings. But there's enough in common for us as human beings, not just for our sake, but for the animals' sake, to reflect upon what we are doing and what is being done in our name generally without our knowledge. So I think with those very few little observations, this is a wonderful book. It has an excellent index, which I always look for. It has an excellent table of legislation, and it has good graphs. It's got a wonderful collection of very readable and very upsetting chapters. And on this subject, well, the bottom line is you should be upset. We all should be upset, because it was when we started to get upset about slaves that we did something about slaves. And it was when we got upset about Aboriginals that we did something about Aboriginals. And when enough people got upset about the criminalisation of gays, that things were done to remedy the law. I go tomorrow to the United States again, to the University of Indiana, to receive an honorary degree in the University of Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey, of course, was the man who began this research into sexuality, and tremendous pressure was put on him by the churches and by powerful political interests to stop it. But they had a great president at Indiana University, Herman Wells, and he said, if Dr. Kinsey's research is a suitable matter for inquiry in a university, it will be done at Indiana University. That's in Indiana, United States of America, in the middle of the country, a conservative place, 1950, Joe McCarthy urging that it stop. Well, that's what I was told back 15 years ago. Stop it. Leave this alone. Don't be so emotional. You don't know what you're talking about. The people want the product. Well, the people may want the product. I'm not sure the people want all the pain. Dr. Kinsey began his life as a zoologist. He was the professor of zoology at the university. His big expertise was gall wasps. And he moved out of gall wasps because he saw that there were commonalities. And he then moved into the taxonomy of human beings. And the interrelationship is not accidental. So I will be thinking all my way across of this book. It's very upsetting. If you want to be upset, read this book. And being upset is the beginning of the journey to solutions.